Sarah Mitchell stood at her bedroom window, watching the autumn leaves dance across her front yard in the peaceful suburb of Maple Grove, Connecticut. The golden morning light filtered through the branches of the old oak tree that had been her childhood climbing companion. At 19, she was in that delicate space between adolescence and adulthood, still living with her parents while attending her first year of college at the local university. "Sarah, honey, your breakfast is getting cold." Her mother's voice carried up the stairs, pulling her from her reverie. The familiar scent of cinnamon pancakes wafted through the house, a Tuesday morning tradition in the Mitchell household. Grabbing her backpack, Sarah bounded down the stairs, her long brown hair swaying with each step. In the kitchen, her mother, Eleanor, was already packing her lunch with the usual motherly excess: 2 sandwiches, fruit, and always an extra apple, just in case. "Mom, I'm not hiking the Appalachian Trail," Sarah chuckled, settling at the kitchen island. "It's just another day at college." Eleanor's face softened with concern as she placed the morning newspaper beside Sarah's plate. The headline caught Sarah's attention. "Local residents report suspicious activity in Maple Grove Park." "That's exactly why I pack extra," Eleanor said, tapping the newspaper. "The world isn't always as safe as we'd like it to be. Promise me you'll stay away from the park on your way home?" Sarah's father, James, looked up from his coffee and laptop. "Your mother's right, sweetheart. There have been reports of strangers hanging around there lately. Take the long way home, okay?" Sarah resisted the urge to roll her eyes. At 19, she felt too old for such warnings, yet she knew they came from a place of love. Her parents had always been protective, especially since they'd moved to Maple Grove 5 years ago, seeking a quieter life away from the city. "I promise," Sarah said, though something in her heart whispered that their fears might be misplaced. Growing up, she'd learned that people weren't always what they seemed. Sometimes they were better. The day at college passed in a blur of literature lectures and chemistry labs. Sarah's mind occasionally wandered to the newspaper headline, not out of fear but curiosity. The park had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could think and sketch in her notebook. The idea that it might now be considered dangerous felt wrong somehow. As the afternoon sun began its descent, Sarah found herself standing at the crossroads. To her left lay the longer, safer route home her parents had insisted upon. To her right, the tree-lined path led through Maple Grove Park, where golden leaves created a carpet beneath ancient oaks and maples. She checked her watch. 3:45 p.m. The park would still be filled with dog walkers and young mothers with strollers at this hour. Surely there was no harm in taking her usual route. Besides, she had her phone, and the park was hardly deserted. The decision made, Sarah turned right, her shoes crunching on the fallen leaves. The park welcomed her with its familiar embrace, the creaking of branches in the wind, the distant laughter of children on the playground, the earthy scent of autumn. As she walked deeper into the park, her mother's extra apple weighed in her backpack, a reminder of home and safety. The setting sun painted the trees in shades of amber and gold, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Sarah pulled out her sketchbook, wanting to capture the way the light filtered through the leaves. That's when she saw him, a figure sitting alone on a bench, slightly hunched, wearing clothes that had seen better days. He wasn't what her parents would call suspicious. Rather, he seemed lost in thought, staring at a worn photograph in his trembling hands. Something about his posture spoke of dignity, despite hardship, of a story waiting to be told. Sarah's hand paused over her sketchbook, her artist's eye noting the way his silver-streaked hair caught the late afternoon light, how his weathered face seemed to hold both wisdom and sorrow. As if sensing her presence, the man looked up, quickly tucking the photograph into his pocket. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah saw something that made her pause. Not danger or darkness, but a profound sadness that struck a chord deep within her. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, warning of strangers and suspicious people. But as she stood there, holding her mother's extra apple, Sarah faced a choice that would unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just one life, but an entire community. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the whisper of possibility as Sarah took her first step toward the bench, her heart guiding her toward a moment that would change everything. The distance between Sarah and the bench seemed to stretch endlessly as she took each careful step forward. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a rhythmic reminder of her parents' warnings echoing in her mind. Yet something stronger pulled her forward, an inexplicable certainty that this moment mattered. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice steadier than she expected. "Would you like an apple?" The man looked up again, surprise flickering across his weathered features. Up close, Sarah could see that his clothes, though worn, were clean, and his eyes held an unexpected intelligence that reminded her of her favorite literature professor. "That's very kind of you," he replied, his voice carrying the refined tone of someone educated, though it cracked slightly from disuse. "But I wouldn't want to take your lunch." Sarah smiled, pulling out both apples from her bag. "My mom always packs extra. She says you never know when someone might need it more than you do." She paused, then added, "I'm Sarah." The man seemed to debate internally for a moment before accepting the apple with careful hands. "Robert," he offered in return. "Robert Harrison." He polished the apple against his jacket with a gesture so professor-like that Sarah's initial impression strengthened. "Do you come to the park often?" Sarah asked, settling on the opposite end of the bench. She pulled out her water bottle as well, offering it to him first. Robert's eyes misted slightly as he looked at the apple in his hands. "I used to bring my students here," he said quietly. "We'd have outdoor literature classes under that old oak tree." He nodded toward a massive tree a few yards away. "You were a teacher?" Sarah leaned forward, intrigued. "English literature at Riverside High," he confirmed, a shadow crossing his face. "That was before." Sarah noticed how he gripped the apple tighter, his knuckles whitening. "I'm studying literature at Connecticut State," she offered, hoping to keep the conversation going. "We're reading To Kill a Mockingbird right now." Robert's face transformed, years seeming to fall away as he straightened up. "Ah, Harper Lee's masterpiece. You know, I always started my fall semester with that book. The way it explores humanity's capacity for both cruelty and kindness." He trailed off, lost in memory. As they talked, the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and orange. Robert spoke with passion about literature, seamlessly quoting passages from classics and analyzing their deeper meanings. Sarah found herself scrambling for her notebook, jotting down his insights about symbolism in Steinbeck and the social commentary in Austen's works. "You really know your stuff," Sarah said admiringly. "I bet you were an amazing teacher." The compliment seemed to deflate him somehow. "That life feels like a different world now," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the half-eaten apple in his hands. Sarah wanted to ask what had happened. What bridge had collapsed between his past life as a respected teacher and his present circumstances? But something in his expression held her back. Instead, she pulled out her sketchpad. "Would you mind if I drew you?" she asked impulsively. "The light is perfect right now, and you have very interesting features." Robert's surprise returned, followed by a gentle smile that transformed his entire face. "No one's asked to draw me in a very long time," he said softly. "Though I suspect I'm not as photogenic as I once was." As Sarah began to sketch, Robert returned to discussing literature, his voice growing stronger as he shared his knowledge. She captured not just his features, but the animation in his eyes when he spoke about his passion for teaching, the elegant gestures of his hands as he explained concepts, the dignity that seemed to cloak him despite his circumstances. The drawing took shape, a portrait not of a homeless man, but of a scholar, a teacher, someone who had once stood before a classroom and opened young minds to the power of words. Sarah added subtle details, the way he held himself, the intelligence in his eyes, the suggestion of a past life in his bearing. Neither of them noticed the lengthening shadows until a police cruiser pulled up slowly along the park's path. The sight of it made Robert tense, his entire demeanor changing in an instant. He stood up abruptly, tucking the remainder of the apple into his pocket. "Thank you, Sarah," he said hurriedly, "for the apple, the conversation, and most of all, for seeing me as a person worth drawing. But you should head home now. It's getting late, and your parents will worry." Before Sarah could respond, Robert had gathered his few possessions and was walking quickly away, his shoulders hunched against the cooling evening air. She watched him disappear among the trees, her unfinished sketch still open on her lap, her heart heavy with questions. Looking down at the drawing, Sarah realized she had captured something beyond mere physical features. She had drawn the echo of who Robert Harrison used to be, and perhaps somehow still was beneath the circumstances that had brought him to this park bench. The walk home felt longer than usual, Sarah's mind replaying every detail of her conversation with Robert. The weight of her sketchbook seemed heavier now, carrying not just a drawing but the story of a man who had somehow lost his way from the classroom to the park bench. As she turned onto Maple Street, the sight of a police car in her driveway made her stomach drop. Her mother stood on the front porch, arms crossed tightly across her chest, while her father spoke with two officers on the lawn. "Sarah!" Eleanor rushed forward, enveloping her in a fierce hug. "Where have you been? We've been worried sick." "Mom, I'm fine," Sarah assured her, though guilt gnawed at her conscience. "I just lost track of time at the park." "The park?" James Mitchell's voice carried across the lawn, sharp with concern. "Didn't we specifically ask you to avoid the park?" One of the officers, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair at her temples, stepped forward. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Detective Lisa Cooper. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your interaction with Robert Harrison this afternoon." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "How did you—" "Mrs. Henderson was walking her dog," Eleanor cut in. "She saw you sitting with that man, and called us immediately. Thank goodness she did." "Robert's not dangerous," Sarah protested, clutching her sketchbook closer. "He's a former teacher. We talked about literature and—" "Sarah," Detective Cooper interrupted gently. "Mr. Harrison is wanted for questioning regarding a series of thefts from the local library and bookstore. Witnesses reported seeing someone matching his description leaving with valuable first editions." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought of Robert's passionate discussion of literature, his careful handling of her apple, the photograph he'd been studying when she first saw him. None of it aligned with the picture the detective was painting. "There must be some mistake," she insisted. "He was quoting classical literature, analyzing themes. He knew things only a real teacher would know." The second officer, younger and more stern-faced, stepped forward. "That's because he was a teacher, Miss Mitchell. Records confirm he taught at Riverside High for 15 years. "But after the accident—" "Thompson," Detective Cooper warned, silencing her partner with a look. Sarah's mind raced. "What accident? Please, I need to understand." The adults exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Detective Cooper sighed. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion inside." In the living room, Sarah perched on the edge of the sofa, her parents hovering protectively nearby as Detective Cooper explained the situation. Robert Harrison had indeed been a respected English teacher at Riverside High until 3 years ago. A tragic car accident had claimed the life of his wife, leaving him severely injured and unable to work for months. "The medical bills piled up," Detective Cooper continued. "He lost his house, his job, everything. The school board had to let him go when he couldn't return to teaching. After that, he seemed to disappear until recently." "And now he's stealing books?" Sarah asked incredulously. "We believe he's been taking specific volumes, first editions of classic literature, valuable teaching materials. Nothing else has been touched. It's as if he's trying to rebuild his classroom," Sarah finished softly, opening her sketchbook to Robert's portrait. The dignified sadness she'd captured made perfect sense now. Detective Cooper studied the drawing with interest. "This is excellent work. You've really captured his essence." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Sarah, we need your help. Mr. Harrison needs help. But first, we need to find him. Would you be willing to give a statement about your interaction with him today?" Sarah looked at her parents, seeing the worry in their eyes, slowly giving way to understanding. Her mother had always taught her that kindness was important, that everyone deserved compassion. Her father had raised her to stand up for what she believed was right. "If I help," Sarah said carefully, "what will happen to him?" "That depends partly on him," Detective Cooper replied honestly. "But I promise you, our goal isn't to punish him. There are programs, resources available. Sometimes people just need a bridge back to the life they lost." Sarah thought of the way Robert's eyes had lit up when discussing literature, how his hands had trembled holding the photograph, the careful way he'd accepted her apple. She opened her sketchbook again, showing Detective Cooper the details she'd captured, the proud set of his shoulders, the scholarly air that remained despite his circumstances. Then I'll help, she decided, but I want to be involved. I want to make sure he gets that chance. Detective Cooper nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. I think, Miss Mitchell, you've already started that process. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see beyond the surface. As the detectives began taking her statement, Sarah described every detail of her conversation with Robert, painting a picture not of a thief, but of a man who had lost his way and perhaps, just perhaps, was ready to find his way back. Her simple act of sharing an apple had opened a door. Now it was time to help him walk through it. The next morning dawned with a new sense of purpose. Sarah had barely slept, her mind churning with thoughts of Robert and the story Detective Cooper had shared. During breakfast, she pushed her eggs around her plate, distracted by an idea taking shape in her mind. Mom, she began carefully, what if we could help him? Eleanor paused in the middle of packing Sarah's lunch. Just one apple today. Help who, honey? Robert Harrison, the man from the park. Sarah took a deep breath. Detective Cooper said there are programs available, resources. But he'd need someone to advocate for him, wouldn't he? Someone to show that he deserves a second chance. Her father lowered his newspaper, exchanging a look with Eleanor. Sarah, sweetheart, I know your heart's in the right place, but this is a complicated situation. Is it, though? Sarah pulled out her sketchbook, opening it to Robert's portrait. Look at him, really look. This isn't someone who's lost. This is someone who's just taken a wrong turn. He needs a map back, that's all. Eleanor moved closer, studying the drawing. Sarah watched as her mother's expression softened, recognizing the humanity Sarah had captured in the portrait. Tell me what you're thinking, Eleanor said finally. Sarah's words tumbled out in a rush. I did some research last night. There's a program at the community center. They help people get back on their feet. Job training, housing assistance, counseling. But they need referrals, and they need volunteers. And you want to volunteer, James stated, not a question. I want us to volunteer, Sarah corrected. Dad, you're on the school board. Mom, you organize half the community events in Maple Grove. If we could show people who Robert really is, what he's been through. Sarah, her father interrupted. He's still taken things that don't belong to him. That has to be addressed. I know, Sarah nodded. But Detective Cooper said he only took books, teaching materials. What if we could help him return them? What if we could show him there's a better way back to the life he loves? Before her parents could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Cooper. We found him. He's at the library. Thought you should know. Sarah's heart leaped. He's at the library right now. Please, can we go? Maybe if he sees that people want to help, that there's hope. James and Eleanor shared another long look, years of marriage allowing for silent communication. Finally, her father stood. Get your coat, he said. But we do this carefully, and we follow Detective Cooper's lead. The drive to the library was tense with anticipation. As they pulled into the parking lot, Sarah spotted Detective Cooper's unmarked car and several other police vehicles parked discreetly at different entrances. The detective herself waited for them at the front steps. He's inside, Cooper said quietly as they approached. In the classics section. He's just sitting there, reading To Kill a Mockingbird to himself. Sarah's heart clenched, remembering their conversation about Harper Lee. Let me talk to him, she pleaded. Just for a minute. Detective Cooper studied her thoughtfully. My officers are in position, but we'd rather this didn't become a scene. If you think you can reach him, she glanced at Sarah's parents, who nodded their reluctant agreement. Inside, the library was hushed and warm, morning sunlight streaming through tall windows. Sarah found Robert exactly where Cooper had said, seated in a worn armchair, his fingers tracing the words on the page as if they were braille, memorizing them through touch. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, Sarah quoted softly, approaching the chair. Until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it. Robert looked up, unsurprised to see her. Scout's lesson about empathy. he murmured. "You were paying attention yesterday." "I was." Sarah moved closer, aware of but trying to ignore the watchful eyes around them. "And I'm paying attention now. I know about the accident, Robert. About what happened after." His hands tightened on the book. "Then you know I'm not the person you thought I was." "Actually," Sarah sat in the chair opposite him, "I think you're exactly who I thought you were. A teacher who never stopped loving books, who never stopped wanting to share them with others. But sometimes the way back to who we were isn't the way we think." She reached into her bag, pulling out her sketchbook. "I finished your portrait last night. Would you like to see how I see you?" Robert's hands trembled as he accepted the sketchbook. His eyes widened as he took in the drawing, the dignity Sarah had captured, the wisdom and warmth in his expression, the hint of his former self shining through the present circumstances. "Is this really how you see me?" he whispered. "It's how everyone could see you," Sarah said gently. "If you let them help. If you let us help." Robert's shoulders sagged, years of pride and pain warring on his face. "I never meant to take them permanently," he said softly, gesturing to the books around them. I couldn't bear being away from them, from teaching. It was all I had left." "It doesn't have to be all you have." Sarah leaned forward, her voice urgent but kind. "There are programs, people who want to help. You can teach again, Robert. Maybe not in a traditional classroom right away, but there are other ways. Let us show you." The silence in the library stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Robert's fingers traced the edge of Sarah's sketchbook, his eyes moving between the portrait and the scattered books surrounding his chair. Each volume told a story beyond its printed pages. They were pieces of his attempt to hold onto a life that had slipped away. Detective Cooper approached slowly, her footsteps deliberately audible on the library's wooden floor. "Mr. Harrison," she said softly, "we need to talk about the books." Robert's posture stiffened, but Sarah noticed he didn't attempt to flee. Instead, he carefully closed "To Kill a Mockingbird" and placed it on the side table. "I know where each one is," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious anxiety. "I can help return them all." "That's good," Cooper nodded, pulling up another chair to join their small circle. "That's a start. But we need to talk about what happens next." Sarah watched as her parents moved closer, her mother's face softening with compassion as she took in Robert's appearance in the morning light. James Mitchell stood slightly behind his wife, his expression thoughtful as he observed the scene unfolding before him. "I've been making some calls," Detective Cooper continued, her tone professional but kind. "The library board is willing to be reasonable, especially if everything is returned in good condition. But they have some conditions." Robert straightened in his chair, a flash of his former professional demeanor showing through. "What kind of conditions?" "First," Cooper consulted her notebook, "you'll need to enter a rehabilitation program. The community center has an excellent one that includes temporary housing." Sarah's heart leaped. It was exactly the program she'd researched the night before. She caught her father's eye, and he gave her a slight nod, suggesting he might have had something to do with this arrangement. "Second," Cooper continued, "you'll need to make amends. The library board suggests community service, here at the library." Robert's eyes widened slightly. "They'd let me work here, after what I did." "Under supervision, initially," Cooper clarified. "But yes, Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, remembers you from your teaching days. She thinks your knowledge could be valuable, especially in the classics section." Sarah watched as hope flickered across Robert's face, like sunlight breaking through clouds. But then doubt crept in, his shoulders slumping slightly. "The program, I don't have any way to pay for it." "That's where we come in." Eleanor Mitchell stepped forward, speaking for the first time. "The community center's program is funded by local donations. My charity committee has some discretionary funds we can allocate. And," James added, moving to stand beside his wife, "I've spoken with some members of the school board. While returning to formal teaching might take time, there are other opportunities. The adult education program at the community center always needs qualified instructors." Robert's hands trembled as he reached for the photograph he always carried, the one Sarah had seen him studying in the park. He pulled it out carefully, showing it to them. It was a classroom photo showing a younger Robert surrounded by smiling students, books lining the walls behind them. "This was my last class," he explained softly. "Before everything. Before I lost my way. I keep it to remind myself of who I used to be, who I still want to be." Sarah reached out impulsively, touching the edge of the photograph. "You never stopped being that person, Robert. You just got lost for a while. But you don't have to find your way back alone. The program starts next Monday," Detective Cooper said. "Until then, we can arrange temporary accommodation at the Gateway Hotel. But I need your answer now, Mr. Harrison. Are you willing to accept these conditions?" Robert looked around the circle of faces. Sarah's earnest hope, Detective Cooper's professional compassion, Eleanor's maternal concern, James's measured evaluation, and back to the portrait Sarah had drawn, showing him not as he was, but as he could be again. "Could I—" He hesitated, then continued more firmly. "Could I start by helping to return the books today? They should all go back exactly where they belong. I think that's an excellent place to start." Cooper smiled. "Mrs. Chen is already preparing a cart." As if on cue, the diminutive head librarian appeared, pushing a book cart and wearing a determined expression. "Mr. Harrison," she said briskly, "these books have been terribly misorganized in your absence. I trust you remember the proper shelving system?" For the first time, Sarah saw a genuine smile break across Robert's face. "Dewey Decimal System," he said, standing up straighter. "I never forgot." "Good," Mrs. Chen nodded decisively. "Then let's begin. Sarah, if you're not too busy with your studies, we could use another pair of hands." Sarah looked at her parents questioningly. Her mother's eyes were suspiciously bright as she nodded. "Go on," Eleanor said softly. "Help get things back where they belong." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Sarah split her time between classes and the library, where Robert worked diligently to return each book to its proper place. What started as a simple task of reorganizing books transformed into something more meaningful, as Robert began sharing stories about each volume he handled. "This edition of Great Expectations," he explained to Sarah one afternoon, carefully sliding the book into place, "was the first book that made me want to become a teacher. I was 16 when I first read it, and Pip's journey of self-discovery, it changed everything for me." Mrs. Chen, who had been pretending to dust nearby shelves, moved closer. "Tell me more about that," she encouraged, her shrewd eyes watching Robert's reactions. As Robert spoke about literature, his passion was infectious. Other library patrons began to linger, drawn by his eloquent descriptions and deep understanding of the classics. Sarah noticed Mrs. Chen taking notes, a thoughtful expression on her face. On Friday afternoon, as they were finishing up the last shelf, Mrs. Chen called them both to her office. The small room was cluttered with books and papers, but her desk was meticulously organized. She gestured for them to sit. "Mr. Harrison," she began, adjusting her glasses, "I've been observing you this week. Your knowledge of literature is, as I remembered, exceptional. But what's impressed me more is your ability to communicate that knowledge to others." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I've just been talking about the books." "Exactly," Mrs. Chen nodded firmly. "And people have been listening. I've had 3 different patrons ask if we offer literature discussion groups." She paused meaningfully. "We don't, but perhaps we should." Sarah sat up straighter, seeing where this was heading. "Are you suggesting—" "The community center program you're entering includes a service component," Mrs. Chen continued. "I'd like to propose something specific. A weekly literature circle here at the library. You would select the readings and guide the discussions, under my supervision, of course." Robert's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "You'd trust me with that?" "Trust must be rebuilt gradually," Mrs. Chen said frankly. "But yes, I believe this could be a good first step. Sarah has offered to help coordinate, and I'll be overseeing everything." Sarah watched as Robert processed this opportunity. She could almost see him imagining it, a chance to teach again, to share his love of literature, to begin rebuilding his life one book discussion at a time. "When could we start?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The community center program begins Monday." Mrs. Chen consulted her calendar. "Give yourself 2 weeks to settle in, then we'll begin planning. Sarah, you'll help create flyers and handle social media announcements?" Sarah nodded enthusiastically, already envisioning how to promote the program. Her mind raced with ideas for reaching out to college students, retirees, and everyone in between who might be interested in discussing classic literature. As they left the library that evening, Sarah noticed Robert standing taller, his steps more purposeful. The Gateway Hotel where he was staying temporarily was just a few blocks away, and she'd gotten into the habit of walking with him, their conversations about books filling the time. "What book would you choose?" she asked as they walked. "For the first discussion group?" Robert considered this carefully. To Kill a Mockingbird might seem too obvious now, he mused. Perhaps The Great Gatsby. It's a story about reinvention, about the cost of dreams, about second chances. He trailed off, lost in thought. And about hope, Sarah added softly. The green light at the end of Daisy's Dock. It's about never giving up hope. They stopped at the hotel entrance. Robert turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "Why did you do it?" he asked suddenly. "That first day in the park. Why did you stop to talk to me?" Sarah thought about that moment, about the apple in her bag and the man on the bench. "Because everyone deserves to be seen," she said finally. "Really seen, not just looked at. My mom always taught me that kindness matters, but I think what matters more is recognizing the humanity in each person we meet." Robert nodded slowly, understanding filling his eyes. "Your mother sounds wise. Would your family consider coming to the first discussion group? When it happens?" "Try keeping them away," Sarah laughed. "Mom's already telling her friends about it. And Dad, well, let's just say the school board might be very interested in how this program develops." For a moment, Robert's eyes misted over. "I never expected," he began, then cleared his throat. "Thank you, Sarah, for seeing me." As Sarah walked home in the gathering dusk, she thought about transformation, how it rarely happens in grand, dramatic moments, but rather in small steps, in quiet conversations, in the simple act of one person reaching out to another. The first discussion group was still weeks away, but already she could feel the ripples of change spreading through their community, one gesture of kindness at a time. Monday morning arrived with the weight of expectation. Sarah had insisted on accompanying Robert to the community center, despite her parents' gentle reminder about her morning classes. "Some things are more important than perfect attendance," she had argued at breakfast, and to her surprise, both her parents had agreed. The Maple Grove Community Center stood as a testament to better days, its red brick facade weathered but dignified. Robert paused at the bottom of the concrete steps, adjusting the strap of the second-hand backpack Eleanor had found for him. Inside were a few essential items the Mitchells had helped him acquire. Some clothing, toiletries, and a leather-bound journal Sarah had given him to start writing his new chapter. "Ready?" Sarah asked, standing beside him. Robert's hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket, touching the class photograph he always carried. "What if I can't?" he started, then stopped, squaring his shoulders. "What if I'm too old to start over?" "You're not starting over," Sarah corrected gently. "You're continuing your story from a new perspective. Like when Pip realizes his great expectations weren't what he thought they'd be, but finds something more meaningful instead." A ghost of a smile crossed Robert's face. "Using literary references against your former English teacher? Well played." Inside, they were greeted by Ms. Gloria Washington, the program director. She was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to look straight through any pretense. "Mr. Harrison," she said warmly, extending her hand. "We've been expecting you." The intake process was both more and less overwhelming than Robert had feared. Ms. Washington's questions were direct but kind, her manner professional yet understanding. Sarah sat quietly in the corner, offering silent support as Robert answered questions about his background, his needs, and his goals. "I see here that Mrs. Chen at the library has already proposed a project for your community service component," Ms. Washington noted, reviewing her files. "A literature discussion group." "Yes," Robert's voice grew stronger when discussing this topic. "We're planning to start in 2 weeks, assuming you feel ready," Ms. Washington completed the thought. "That's good. Having a goal is important, but so is understanding that healing takes time." She looked up from her papers, fixing Robert with a keen gaze. "Tell me, Mr. Harrison, what scares you most about this process?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Sarah watched as Robert struggled with his answer, his hands clasping and unclasping in his lap. "Failing again," he finally admitted. "I've already lost everything once. The thought of trying and failing again. That's why we call this a program, not a test," Ms. Washington replied. "You're not here to pass or fail. You're here to heal, to rebuild. And yes, sometimes that means taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The question is, are you willing to keep moving forward, even when it gets difficult?" Robert reached into his pocket, pulling out the class photograph. He placed it on Ms. Washington's desk. "These students," he said softly, "they trusted me to guide them, to teach them. I want to be worthy of that trust again. Mrs. Washington studied the photograph, then looked at Sarah sitting quietly in the corner. "It seems to me," she said thoughtfully, "that you already have people who trust you, who see your worth." She handed the photograph back. "The question is, can you trust yourself?" The rest of the morning passed in a blur of paperwork and orientations. Robert was shown to his temporary room in the residential wing, a small but clean space with a bed, desk, and window overlooking the center's garden. Sarah helped him arrange his few belongings, noting how he placed the class photograph on the desk where he could see it while working. "The walls could use some decoration," she mused, pulling out her sketchbook. She carefully removed the portrait she'd drawn of him in the park, handing it to him. "Maybe this will remind you of how others see you, on days when it's hard to remember." Robert accepted the drawing with evident emotion. "Sarah, I can't take this. Your artwork is meant to be seen," she finished firmly. "Besides, I've already started a new sketch. You in the library, teaching again. That one's not finished yet, but when it is, maybe we can hang it in the discussion group room." A knock at the door interrupted Robert's response. Ms. Washington stood in the doorway, holding a stack of books. "The library sent these over," she explained. "Mrs. Chen thought you might like to start planning your first discussion session. And Sarah," she added with a knowing look, "I believe you have an afternoon class to attend." Sarah checked her watch and gasped. She had just enough time to make it to her literature class if she hurried. "Will you be okay?" she asked Robert, suddenly reluctant to leave. Robert looked around the small room, at the books on his desk, the portrait on his wall, the photograph that connected his past to his present. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm exactly where I need to be right now." As Sarah hurried across town to her class, she thought about new beginnings and how they rarely look the way we expect them to. Robert's road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't walking it alone anymore. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest steps. An apple shared, a portrait drawn, a hand extended in friendship. 2 weeks into the program, the transformation in Robert was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders had straightened. His clothes, donated by local community members after Eleanor Mitchell quietly spread the word, fit properly now. But the most significant change was in his eyes. The haunted look had been replaced by something approaching peace. Sarah visited whenever her class schedule allowed, often finding him in the community center's small library, surrounded by books and notes as he planned the upcoming discussion group. Today, she arrived to find him in an animated conversation with Ms. Washington. "The response has been remarkable," Ms. Washington was saying, reviewing a list. "We already have 15 people signed up for the first session, and Mrs. Chen says more are asking about it at the library." Robert looked up as Sarah entered, his face brightening. "Sarah, perfect timing. What do you think about this as our first reading list?" He handed her a carefully typed sheet of paper. Sarah scanned the selections, The Great Gatsby, as discussed, but also shorter works by diverse authors, Langston Hughes, Sandra Cisneros, Amy Tan. "You're not just sticking to the classics," she observed. "I've been thinking about what literature really means," Robert explained, his voice taking on the passionate tone that Sarah had come to associate with his teacher mode. "It's not just about studying the past. It's about understanding the human experience from all perspectives. Ms. Washington has been helping me see that." Ms. Washington smiled warmly. "Mr. Harrison brings a wealth of knowledge about traditional classics, but he's also shown a remarkable openness to expanding the canon. Our residents have been particularly interested in his lunchtime reading recommendations. This was news to Sarah. Lunchtime readings? Robert ducked his head modestly. It started by accident. Some of the other residents noticed me reading in the dining hall, and we got to talking about books. Now we have informal discussions during lunch. Nothing structured, just conversations about stories that matter. "That's amazing!" Sarah exclaimed, but she noticed Robert's expression shift slightly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, exactly," he hesitated. "It's just..." One of the younger residents reminded me of Tommy Chen from my last class. Same enthusiasm for poetry, same way of seeing the world differently. He touched the class photograph on his desk. "I've been wondering how they're all doing, my former students." Ms. Washington and Sarah exchanged glances. "Actually," Sarah said carefully, "I might know something about that. Dad's been making some calls, talking to people at Riverside High." Robert's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "Well, it seems word has gotten around about your literature group. Some of your former students, they're in college now but still local, they've heard about it. They've been asking if they can come." The emotion that crossed Robert's face was complex. Hope mingled with fear, joy with uncertainty. "They want to, even after..." "They remember you, Robert," Sarah said gently. "They remember the teacher who opened their minds to new worlds through literature. That's who you still are." Ms. Washington cleared her throat. "Which brings us to another matter. The Community Center Board met yesterday. They've been very impressed with your progress, Mr. Harrison, and with the interest your literature group has generated. They'd like to expand the program." "Expand?" Robert asked. "We're proposing a broader literary outreach program. The discussion group would be just the beginning. We'd like to add a mentoring component for struggling readers, possibly some writing workshops. All under your guidance, of course, with appropriate supervision." Robert sat very still, absorbing this information. "You'd trust me with that level of responsibility?" "Trust is earned," Ms. Washington replied firmly, "and you've been earning it step by step, day by day. The question is, do you trust yourself enough to accept this opportunity?" Sarah watched as Robert stood and walked to the window, looking out over the center's garden. Someone had been working there recently. New flowers were beginning to bloom despite the late season. "When I was teaching," he said slowly, "I always told my students that literature has the power to change lives. One story, one poem, one moment of understanding. That's all it takes to shift someone's perspective forever." He turned back to face them. "I lost sight of that truth when I lost everything else. But maybe this is my chance to prove it again." "Is that a yes?" Ms. Washington pressed gently. "It's a yes," Robert smiled, then added more seriously. "But I'd like to start small. Get the discussion group running smoothly first. Really make it work. Then we can think about expanding." "Wise decision," Ms. Washington approved. "Now, about these former students who want to attend. How do you want to handle that?" Robert picked up his reading list, studying it thoughtfully. "They're not students anymore," he said finally. "They're young adults who want to discuss literature. Just like anyone else in the group. Though," he added with a hint of his old teaching demeanor, "I hope they've been keeping up with their reading." Sarah laughed, remembering something. "Actually, I found out that Tommy Chen is studying literature in college now. He told his professor that you were the one who inspired him to pursue it." Robert's eyes misted over slightly, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Then we'd better make sure this discussion group lives up to his expectations. Sarah, could you help me revise this reading list? I want to make sure we're including voices that will resonate with everyone." As they bent over the reading list together, Sarah noticed Ms. Washington watching them with satisfaction. Small steps had led to bigger ones, and now those steps were creating ripples throughout the community. One act of kindness in a park had grown into something none of them could have predicted, touching lives far beyond their initial expectations. The library's meeting room had never felt so alive. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching people filter in for the first literature discussion group. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself, transforming the usually stark space with comfortable chairs arranged in a welcoming circle. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the fresh flowers Eleanor had brought. Every new beginning deserves flowers, she had insisted. Robert stood near the whiteboard, adjusting and readjusting his tie. Another gift from the community, this one from James Mitchell's own closet. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged his notes, but his eyes were clear and focused. "Deep breath," Sarah reminded him softly, approaching with 2 cups of tea from the refreshment table her mother had organized. "They're here because they want to be." The room was filling quickly. Sarah recognized faces from around town. Her literature professor from the college, several regular library patrons, even Detective Cooper, who had swapped her badge for a well-worn copy of The Great Gatsby. But it was the next arrival that made Robert freeze mid-motion. "Mr. Harrison?" Tommy Chen stood in the doorway, now a tall college sophomore rather than the high school student from the photograph, but with the same bright, questioning eyes. Behind him, 3 more former students hovered uncertainly. "Tommy," Robert's voice cracked slightly. "You've grown." "College food," Tommy joked weakly, then rushed forward, hand extended. "I can't believe you're really here." When Maria told me about the discussion group, he gestured to another former student who had entered with him. Robert shook Tommy's hand firmly, then found himself surrounded by his former students, each eager to share their stories. Maria was studying journalism, inspired by their discussions of war correspondence in All Quiet on the Western Front. James had just declared an English minor, thanks to their poetry units. Sarah watched as Robert's nervous tension melted away, replaced by genuine joy as he listened to these young adults describe how his teaching had influenced their paths. "Mrs. Chen appeared at her elbow, satisfaction evident in her expression. "Sometimes," the librarian said quietly, "we don't realize the seeds we've planted until they bloom in unexpected places." At exactly 4 o'clock, Robert cleared his throat. The chatter in the room settled naturally, muscle memory from classroom days kicking in among his former students, spreading to the rest of the group. "Welcome," Robert began, his teacher's voice strong and clear. "Thank you all for being here today. We're going to discuss The Great Gatsby. But first, I'd like to talk about why we read it all." He moved to the whiteboard, picking up a marker with steady hands. "Literature isn't just about stories. It's about understanding. Each book is a bridge, connecting us to experiences and perspectives we might never encounter in our own lives. When we read, we learn to see the world through different eyes." Sarah watched the room lean forward collectively, drawn in by Robert's natural ability to engage his audience. He wrote perspective on the whiteboard in his neat teacher's script. In The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald gives us multiple perspectives on the American dream. Through Nick Carraway's eyes, we see both the allure and the corruption of wealth. Through Gatsby himself, we understand the power of hope and reinvention, but also the danger of living too much in an idealized past. Tommy's hand shot up, muscle memory again. Like how Gatsby tried to recreate a perfect moment that never really existed. "Exactly," Robert smiled. "And what might that tell us about our own tendencies to idealize our past?" The discussion flowed naturally from there, with Robert guiding rather than dominating the conversation. Sarah watched in amazement as different generations connected over the text. Her literature professor engaging in friendly debate with Tommy about symbolism, Detective Cooper offering insights about human nature from her years of experience, Maria drawing parallels to modern social media's curated realities. Halfway through, Sarah noticed Ms. Washington slip quietly into the room, observing from the back. The program director's face showed clear approval as she watched Robert in his element, facilitating connections not just with the text, but between participants. As the session neared its end, Robert initiated a final round of thoughts. "Before we wrap up," he said, "I'd like each of us to share one thing we're taking away from today's discussion. Not just about the book, but about our own experiences with second chances and reinvention." The responses were thoughtful, personal. Tommy spoke about learning to forgive himself for changing his major 3 times. Maria discussed overcoming her fear of writing. Detective Cooper reflected on how her perspective on justice had evolved over her career. When it came to Robert's turn, he was quiet for a moment, looking around the circle at faces both familiar and new. "What I'm taking away," he said finally, "is that while we can't rewrite our past, like Gatsby tried to do, we can choose how our story continues. Each day is a new page, and we're all co-authors in each other's chapters." The session ended with a buzz of conversation and plans for next week's reading. As people began to leave, Sarah overheard Tommy making arrangements with some of the other participants to meet for coffee and continue their discussion of the green light symbolism. Robert remained in his chair, watching the spontaneous connections forming around him, a look of peaceful wonder on his face. The room was still full of voices, but now they were voices sharing stories, building bridges, creating community, one page at a time. The success of the first literature discussion group rippled through Maple Grove like a stone cast in still water. Within weeks, what had started as a single weekly meeting expanded into something larger than anyone had anticipated. The library's meeting room could barely contain the growing number of participants, and Mrs. Chen found herself reorganizing the space constantly to accommodate new faces. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah arrived at the community center to find Robert surrounded by a stack of letters. He looked up as she entered, his eyes bright with emotion. "These started arriving last week," he explained, gesturing to the pile. "Letters from people who've heard about the program. Not just locals, people from neighboring towns too. Listen to this one." He picked up a letter and read, "Dear Mr. Harrison, I heard about your literature group from my grandmother, who attends your weekly sessions. She hasn't been this excited about books since before my grandfather passed. She calls me after every meeting to discuss what she's learned. Last week, she talked for an hour about symbolism in Their Eyes Were Watching God. I haven't heard her this alive in years." Sarah sat down, touched by the letter's contents. "How many are there?" "Dozens," Robert replied, carefully returning the letter to its envelope. "Some from former students I haven't heard from in years. Others from complete strangers. This one," he held up another envelope, "is from a teacher in Hartford who wants to start a similar program there." Ms. Washington appeared in the doorway, carrying more mail. "The word is spreading," she said, adding the new letters to the pile. "The center's board is impressed. They want to discuss expanding the program even further." Robert looked up sharply. "Further? The mentoring program we discussed? There's funding available. And space. The board thinks your success with the discussion group proves you're ready for more responsibility." Sarah watched Robert process this information. The past month had brought subtle but significant changes to him. His confidence had returned, not the fragile pride that had led to his, but something deeper, more grounded in service to. "What kind of mentoring program?" "We're thinking about at-risk youth, students struggling with reading, kids who might benefit from the kind of guidance you're known for." Tommy Chen has already volunteered to help. "Tommy?" Robert's surprise was evident. "He came to me last week," Ms. Washington smiled. "Said something about paying forward what was given to him. He's not the only one. Maria and several other former students have offered to volunteer as well." Robert stood and walked to the window, looking out at the community center's garden. The flowers Sarah had noticed weeks ago were in full bloom now, their colors bright against the autumn leaves. "I never expected," he began, then paused, collecting his thoughts. "When I was at my lowest, sitting in that park, I thought I had nothing left to offer, no way to make amends for my mistakes. Then Sarah offered me that apple, and everything began to change." He turned back to face them. "But it wasn't just Sarah, was it? It was Detective Cooper choosing understanding over punishment, Mrs. Chen seeing potential instead of problems, the Mitchells offering support instead of judgment. You," he nodded to Ms. Washington, "giving me a chance to rebuild." Everyone who showed up to those discussion groups, willing to share their stories and listen to others. Sarah recognized the tone in his voice. It was his teaching voice, but with a new depth of understanding. "You're thinking about something," she prompted. "What if we made it bigger?" Robert's eyes lit up with purpose. Not just literature discussions and mentoring, but a full program about the power of stories to connect people. We could work with the schools, the library, the community center, create a network of support through shared reading and understanding. Ms. Washington leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on. Think about it. Book clubs for seniors who feel isolated, reading buddies for struggling students, writing workshops for people who need to tell their stories. We could create spaces where different generations, different backgrounds, all come together through literature. Sarah caught Ms. Washington's eye and saw her own excitement reflected there. This was Robert, in his element. Not just teaching, but building bridges, creating connections. The board meeting is next week, Ms. Washington said thoughtfully. Would you be willing to present this idea? Bring it straight from theory to possibility? Robert glanced at the pile of letters, then at Sarah. Would you help me prepare? Both of you? This needs to be more than just my vision. It needs to reflect what the community needs. Of course, Sarah agreed immediately. And I bet Tommy and the others would help too. We could gather input from current participants, get letters of support, and testimonials, Ms. Washington added. I know several center residents whose lives have been touched by your literature groups. Their voices should be heard. Robert sat back down at his desk, pulling a fresh sheet of paper from his drawer. The hands that had trembled writing his first discussion group outline were steady now as he began to sketch out his vision. We'll call it Pages of Connection, he said, writing the title at the top of the page. Because that's what literature does. It connects us, page by page, story by story, heart to heart. As they worked into the afternoon, crafting the proposal, Sarah thought about how far they'd come from that day in the park. One small act of kindness had grown into something none of them could have imagined, touching lives far beyond their initial expectations. The community center's boardroom buzzed with anticipation. Every chair was filled, with additional people standing along the walls. Sarah had never seen such a diverse crowd in one room. Board members in business attire sat alongside students, seniors, and community volunteers. Her parents were there, along with Detective Cooper, Mrs. Chen, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by the literature program. Robert stood at the podium, looking both professional and approachable in his newly tailored suit, a gift from the community after word spread about his upcoming presentation. The nervous teacher from the park had been replaced by someone who carried himself with quiet confidence, earned through weeks of proving himself one page at a time. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice steady. A few months ago, I was a man who had lost his way. I had forgotten something crucial that I used to teach my students, that every story has the potential for revision, for new chapters, for unexpected plot twists that can transform everything. He gestured to the room. Look around you. Each person here has their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams. What we've discovered through our literature program is that when we share these stories, when we connect through books and discussion, something magical happens. Barriers break down. Understanding grows. Community builds. Robert clicked to the first slide of his presentation, showing photos from various discussion groups. But what we're doing now is just the beginning. Today, I want to share with you our vision for Pages of Connection, a comprehensive program that will use the power of literature to transform our entire community. Sarah watched as Robert outlined their proposal, his passion evident in every word. He described the multiple components: mentoring programs for struggling readers, senior citizen book clubs, writing workshops for those needing to tell their stories, cross-generational reading partnerships. And here's why it works, Robert continued, clicking to a new slide. Tommy Chen, would you please stand? Tommy rose from his seat, smiling nervously. 3 years ago, I was Mr. Harrison's student. Today, I'm a college sophomore mentoring high school students who struggle with reading. Every week, I see the same light in their eyes that I once found in Mr. Harrison's classroom, the realization that stories can change how we see the world. Maria stood next without prompting, I'm working with senior citizens at the Maple Grove Retirement Home, reading to those who can no longer read for themselves. Last week, one of my listeners told me it was the first time in years she felt truly heard. One by one, people throughout the room stood to share their experiences. Detective Cooper spoke about using literature to build bridges between law enforcement and at-risk youth. Mrs. Chen described how the library had become a true community hub, alive with discussion and connection. Eleanor Mitchell stood to discuss the impact on local families. My charity committee has seen firsthand how this program brings people together across all social boundaries. It's not just about reading. It's about belonging. Robert let each testimony stand on its own, the collective impact building with each story. When the last person had spoken, he returned to the podium. What you've heard today is more than just success stories. It's evidence of what happens when we choose to see each other, to listen to each other, to share our stories and our lives. Pages of Connection isn't just a program, it's a movement. A movement that says every person's story matters, every voice deserves to be heard, and every life can be transformed through understanding. He picked up a familiar book from the podium, To Kill a Mockingbird. Scout Finch learned that you never really understand someone until you see the world from their point of view. Through Pages of Connection, we're creating spaces where that understanding can grow, where empathy can flourish, where community can strengthen. Sarah watched the board members exchanging glances, nodding thoughtfully. Ms. Washington's smile grew wider with each passing minute. The energy in the room was palpable. Not just support for a program, but investment in a vision. We're not just asking for funding, Robert concluded, his voice strong with conviction. We're inviting you to be part of something transformative. Every dollar invested in this program is an investment in human connection, in community strength, in the power of stories to change lives. He paused, looking around the room. A few months ago, a simple act of kindness, a young woman offering an apple to a stranger in the park, set this all in motion. Imagine what we could do if we multiplied that kindness through an entire community, connecting people one page, one story, one heart at a time. The silence that followed was brief but profound. Then, starting slowly but building quickly, applause filled the room. Sarah saw tears in more than a few eyes, including her own. Ms. Washington was already moving toward the board chairman, who was nodding enthusiastically. As the crowd surrounded Robert with congratulations and questions, Sarah stayed in her seat for a moment, thinking about that day in the park. She had offered an apple, thinking it was such a small gesture. She never imagined it would lead to this, a room full of people united by stories, by connection, by the belief that everyone deserves a chance to revise their own narrative. 1 year later, Sarah stood in Maple Grove Park, watching the autumn leaves dance in the late afternoon light. The bench where she had first met Robert was now adorned with a small plaque, Where Stories Connect. It had been the community's idea, a reminder that small acts of kindness could spark profound changes. The park itself had transformed. What was once considered a place to avoid had become a hub of community activity. Today, it was hosting the first annual Pages of Connection Festival, with reading circles scattered across the grounds, storytelling tents, and book exchange stations. Sarah smiled as she watched Robert leading a group discussion under the old oak tree. He looked completely at home now, dressed casually but professionally, his silver hair catching the sunlight. The haunted look that had once shadowed his eyes was long gone, replaced by the warm confidence of a man who had found his true calling. Hard to believe it all started right here, Eleanor said, appearing at Sarah's side with 2 cups of apple cider. One apple, one conversation, one story at a time, Sarah finished, accepting the cider. She surveyed the festival grounds, taking in the scope of what their community had built together. The Pages of Connection program had exceeded everyone's expectations, spreading beyond Maple Grove to neighboring communities. 3 other towns had already started their own versions of the program, with Robert consulting on their development. Tommy Chen was at a nearby tent, working with a group of middle school students who had struggled with reading. His patient guidance reminded Sarah so much of Robert's teaching style, the same way of drawing people out, making them feel heard and valued. "Sarah," a familiar voice called. She turned to see Maria hurrying toward her, waving a notebook. "You won't believe what just happened at the Senior Center writing workshop. Mrs. Peterson, the one who never wanted to share her stories, she wrote the most beautiful piece about her childhood during World War II. We're adding it to the Community Anthology." The Community Anthology had been one of the program's most successful initiatives, a collection of stories, poems, and memories from Maple Grove residents of all ages. What started as a simple writing project had become a cherished record of their shared history and humanity. Detective Cooper, now a regular program volunteer, was leading a teen book club that focused on understanding different perspectives. Her badge was nowhere in sight as she sat cross-legged on a picnic blanket, deeply engaged in a discussion about empathy and justice with a group of enthusiastic high schoolers. Mrs. Chen had set up a mobile library station, her usual efficiency softened by obvious joy as she helped people find just the right book for their interests. The library's circulation had doubled over the past year, but more importantly, it had become a true community center where people from all walks of life came together to share stories and build connections. Sarah's eyes were drawn back to Robert's group under the oak tree. He was reading aloud now, his teacher's voice carrying clearly in the autumn air. Courage is not a man with a gun in his hand. It's knowing you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway, and you see it through no matter what. The "To Kill a Mockingbird" quote seemed particularly fitting. They had all shown different kinds of courage over the past year. Robert in facing his past and rebuilding his life, the community in opening their hearts to new possibilities, even Sarah herself in learning to trust her instincts about people. Ms. Washington appeared beside them, clipboard in hand but relaxed.
"The board just approved funding for 3 new program initiatives," she announced proudly, "including the youth writing mentor program Robert proposed. He's really found his purpose, hasn't he?" Sarah observed, watching as Robert engaged with his listeners, drawing out their perspectives, building bridges of understanding through stories. "We all have," Ms. Washington replied thoughtfully.
This program, it's shown us what community really means. It's not just about helping one person. It's about creating spaces where everyone can grow, connect, and transform together. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Sarah pulled out her sketchbook. She had filled several volumes over the past year, documenting the program's growth through portraits and scenes. Today's drawing would be special, a panorama of the festival, capturing the moment when their small spark of connection had blazed into something truly remarkable. Robert was closing his session now, his participants lingering to continue their discussions in smaller groups. He caught Sarah's eye and walked over, smiling warmly. "Still drawing?" he asked, gesturing to her sketchbook. "Still teaching?" She countered with a grin. "Always," he replied softly. "Though these days, I think I learn more than I teach." He looked around the park, taking in the scenes of connection and community. "Thank you, Sarah. Not just for the apple, but for seeing me, really seeing me, when I couldn't even see myself." Sarah closed her sketchbook, tucking her pencil away. "That's what stories do, don't they? Help us see ourselves and each other more clearly?" "Indeed they do," Robert agreed. "And our story isn't finished yet." As they stood together watching the festival continue around them, Sarah thought about the power of small beginnings. One apple, one conversation, one moment of connection. Each a single word in the larger story they were all writing together, page by page, heart by heart, in the ongoing narrative of their community. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of voices sharing stories, of laughter, of connections being forged and strengthened. In the growing dusk, the park glowed with lantern light and possibility, a beacon of hope and reminder that every story, no matter how difficult its beginning, has the potential for transformation.